At 59, Helen Carter never imagined the railroad would let her go with a handshake, a cardboard box, and the words, "Your position is no longer needed." After 36 years maintaining signal systems that helped keep thousands of passengers safe, she was forced into early retirement while machines replaced the skills she had spent a lifetime mastering. Determined not to let the last chapter of her life be written by someone else, she spent $180 on a forgotten railroad signal house everyone else considered worthless. Neighbors laughed. Former co-workers quietly shook their heads. They said she was clinging to a past that was never coming back. But just a few nights later, while restoring an old telegraph sounder she believed had been silent for decades, the tiny brass arm suddenly sprang to life. Click, click, click. The rhythm wasn't random. It wasn't faulty wiring. It was a real Morse code message, sent by someone who should have been gone for more than half a century. And when Helen finally translated those forgotten signals, they led to a hidden chapter of American railroad history that someone had tried very hard to erase. Before we discover who was calling from the past, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so we can welcome you to our growing community. And whether you're starting your morning, enjoying your afternoon, or winding down this evening, I hope you're having a wonderful day. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten American history, hidden family legacies, and extraordinary people history almost left behind, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey. Now, let's go back to the day Helen Carter unlocked an abandoned signal house, never imagining that the first voice waiting to greet her would arrive in the language of Morse code. The email arrived at 8:12 on a gray Monday morning, carrying the kind of carefully polished language that softened disappointment without reducing its weight. Helen Carter read every sentence twice before setting her reading glasses on the kitchen table. After 36 years maintaining railroad signal systems across the division, her position had officially been eliminated. The company thanked her for her years of dedicated service, explained that new centralized digital technology had made many field positions unnecessary, and outlined the retirement package waiting for her in the Human Resources office. There was no accusation, no criticism, and no anger hidden between the lines. There was only the unmistakable feeling that a lifetime of experience had quietly become obsolete. Helen sat in silence while the coffee in her favorite mug grew cold. For more than 3 decades, she had started nearly every morning before sunrise, driving miles of railroad to inspect signal cabinets, test relays, replace worn wiring, and respond whenever dispatchers reported a malfunction. She had worked through summer heat, winter snowstorms, and pounding rain because trains never stopped simply because the weather turned bad. She believed every properly working signal represented families arriving safely home, even if no passenger ever knew her name. Now the railroad she loved no longer needed those hands or that knowledge. 2 weeks later, she carried a small cardboard box through the maintenance building for the last time. Inside were framed photographs of coworkers, an old railroad calendar, a brass nameplate from her workbench, and the pocket notebook she had carried almost every day since her first year. One by one, former colleagues stopped to shake her hand. They wished her well, promised to stay in touch, and joked that retirement meant fishing, gardening, or finally taking long vacations. Helen smiled politely, yet none of those plans sounded like the life she wanted. She had never measured her days by hobbies. She measured them by problems solved before they became accidents. As she stepped outside, She turned for one last look at the maintenance shop. Younger technicians moved confidently between new diagnostic equipment and computer terminals. They were capable people, and she held no resentment toward them. Progress had always been part of the railroad. Still, watching the doors close behind her felt strangely like saying goodbye to a language she had spoken her entire adult life. The first weeks at home passed more slowly than she expected. She organized closets that were already neat, repaired loose cabinet hinges, trimmed the hedges in her small yard, and reread novels she barely remembered buying. Every afternoon, the distant sound of passing freight trains drifted through her neighborhood. Without thinking, she found herself identifying locomotive models by their engines and estimating train lengths by the fading rhythm of steel wheels. The railroad remained part of her, even though she was no longer part of it. One Saturday morning, Helen wandered through a community flea market, hoping simply to fill a few quiet hours. Near the entrance, an elderly volunteer from the local historical society had arranged old maps, railroad photographs, and auction notices on a folding table. One yellowing flyer immediately caught her attention. County Surplus Property Auction, the heading read. Among the listed structures sat a single line that made her stop breathing for a moment. Former East Junction Signal House. Minimum bid $180. Helen recognized the building immediately. Years earlier, she had inspected equipment there several times before the line was modernized. The small wooden structure had once overlooked a busy junction where signal operators coordinated train movements long before remote control centers replaced them. She remembered its narrow staircase, tall windows, and weathered telegraph desk tucked into one corner. The volunteer noticed her interest. "Most folks expect it'll be torn down after the sale," he said. "Too old. Too expensive to restore." Helen folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She drove to the property the following afternoon. Tall weeds surrounded the neglected building. Paint peeled from its siding. Several windows were cracked, and vines climbed one exterior wall. Yet despite years of abandonment, the little signal house still stood proudly beside the inactive siding, overlooking rails that continued carrying freight across the countryside. Helen parked along the gravel road and simply watched the building for several minutes. She remembered climbing those same steps with tool bags over her shoulder, replacing worn contacts inside relay cabinets while operators exchanged friendly greetings through open windows. Back then, the building had been alive with responsibility. Now, only the wind moved through broken screens. The auction itself lasted less than 20 minutes. A handful of contractors inspected the property list with little enthusiasm. Most came hoping to purchase scrap materials or storage lots. When the signal house appeared, bidding barely began. One contractor offered the minimum before deciding demolition costs exceeded the building's value. Silence followed. Helen raised her bidder's card. $180, the auctioneer called. He waited, scanned the crowd, and repeated the amount. No one answered. Sold. A few people glanced toward Helen with puzzled expressions. One man quietly remarked that she'd bought herself an expensive pile of rotten lumber. Another laughed that nostalgia always cost more than expected. Helen accepted the paperwork without responding. She wasn't buying an investment. She couldn't even explain exactly why she wanted the place. She only knew she couldn't bear watching another piece of railroad history disappear because everyone had decided it no longer mattered. During the following week, she returned with cleaning supplies, work gloves, flashlights, and a toolbox. Dust coated every surface. Dead leaves had blown across the wooden floor. Broken glass crunched beneath her boots as she carefully opened stiff windows to let fresh air inside. She worked methodically, clearing debris one room at a time, occasionally stopping to recognize familiar pieces of equipment left behind after modernization. Rust covered most of the mechanical levers. Old relay cabinets stood empty. A faded timetable remained pinned beneath cracked glass on one wall. Each object felt like a greeting from another era. Late on the third evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, Helen wiped years of grime from an old brass telegraph sounder mounted on the dispatch desk. She smiled faintly, remembering how operators once recognized entire conversations simply by listening to its steady rhythm. Curious, she gently checked the wiring. Assuming everything had long since gone dead, the room remained perfectly still. Then, without warning, the brass arm lifted and struck the metal base. Click. A heartbeat later, it moved again. Click. Click. Helen froze, her hand still resting on the dusty desk, as the forgotten telegraph sounder continued its slow, deliberate rhythm. Helen remained perfectly still until the telegraph sounder fell silent again. The room seemed almost embarrassed by what had just happened. Dust floated lazily through the fading sunlight, and beyond the tall windows, a freight train rumbled across the distant main line, its steady rhythm fading into the evening. She slowly leaned closer to the brass instrument. The polished arm had moved. She was certain of it. After 36 years maintaining railroad equipment, she trusted her own eyes more than coincidence. She reached out and gently touched the sounder. The metal felt cool beneath her fingertips. The mechanism showed layers of age but little obvious damage. Its wiring disappeared beneath the desk through a hole drilled decades earlier. Helen crouched and followed the cable as far as she could see. The insulation had become brittle, and one section appeared disconnected entirely. By every reasonable explanation, the device should have been lifeless. She checked the old electrical panel mounted on the wall. Most circuits had long been removed after the building was abandoned. The remaining switches showed no signs of supplying power. She even used the small voltage tester she kept in her toolbox. Nothing registered. The room was electrically dead. Yet she had heard 3 distinct clicks. Helen locked the building before leaving for the evening, but she drove home with the sound replaying endlessly in her mind. She considered dozens of possibilities. Perhaps the arm had shifted because of temperature changes after she opened the windows. Perhaps vibration from the passing freight train had caused the movement. Those explanations satisfied the practical side of her thinking, but neither felt completely convincing. The next morning she returned carrying a notebook, fresh batteries for her flashlight, and several basic testing tools. Before cleaning anything else, she focused entirely on the telegraph desk. She carefully removed years of dirt from the sounder using a soft cloth and small brush, exposing the manufacturer's name stamped into the brass base. The device dated back more than 70 years. Despite its age, the internal spring remained surprisingly intact. She traced every visible wire beneath the desk until it disappeared inside the wall. Many sections had clearly been disconnected during modernization. No complete circuit remained. Still, Helen recorded every observation inside her notebook. Old habits were difficult to abandon. Throughout her career, she had learned that careful notes often solved problems faster than assumptions. Shortly before noon, she heard footsteps outside. A young man wearing a utility company jacket appeared in the doorway carrying a toolbox. "Excuse me," he called politely. "I heard someone bought the old signal house." Helen introduced herself. The visitor smiled. "I'm Liam Brooks. I work with the regional engineering team. We passed by yesterday and saw your truck. He glanced around the dusty room with obvious curiosity. Quite a project you've taken on. Helen nodded. I've handled worse. Liam noticed the telegraph sounder resting on the desk. Planning to restore that too? Trying to understand it first. She briefly described hearing the unexpected clicking the previous evening. Liam examined the disconnected wiring before giving a small laugh. If it really clicked, I'd blame mechanical vibration. There's certainly no electrical system left capable of operating it. Helen appreciated that he wasn't dismissive. Only practical. That's what I thought, she admitted, but I'd still like to know why. Together, they spent nearly an hour checking accessible wiring throughout the room. Liam confirmed every measurement Helen had already suspected. No active electrical supply reached the telegraph equipment. Sometimes old metal expands and contracts, he suggested while packing his tools. Buildings settle, springs release tension. Strange noises happen in abandoned places. Helen thanked him for stopping. His explanation made sense, yet she noticed he had referred to strange noises, not deliberate clicks. After Liam left, Helen resumed cleaning. While clearing shelves inside a small storage room, she uncovered several dusty boxes filled with rusted hardware, cracked glass insulators, and faded maintenance forms too damaged to preserve. She sorted everything into careful piles, unwilling to throw away anything before understanding its purpose. Late that afternoon, another visitor arrived. This time, it was a teenage girl balancing a bicycle beside the front steps. Hi, she said shyly. My name's Emma Reed. My history teacher told us someone bought the Signal House. Is it really open? Helen smiled. Not officially. Mostly, it's just very dusty. Emma laughed. I don't mind dust. She explained that she loved local history and often photographed old buildings before they disappeared. Helen invited her inside. Emma wandered through the rooms with genuine fascination, asking thoughtful questions about signal levers, relay cabinets, and equipment whose names most people had forgotten. Helen found herself enjoying the conversation more than she expected. Instead of seeing outdated machinery, Emma saw stories waiting to be understood. Before long, the two worked side by side, sweeping floors and sorting loose papers into boxes. Helen explained how telegraph operators once communicated with dispatchers using Morse code before newer communication systems replaced them. Emma admitted she had heard of Morse, but had never actually seen the equipment. Helen showed her the restored brass sounder. It surprised me yesterday, she said. I thought I heard it working. Emma's eyes widened. Can it still do that? I honestly don't know. As evening approached, they paused to rest beside the old dispatch desk. Outside, another freight train passed along the active main line beyond the abandoned siding. The vibration gently shook loose dust from the ceiling beams. Both women glanced toward the brass instrument almost instinctively. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the arm snapped downward with a sharp metallic click. It paused. Click. Another pause. Click. Helen grabbed her notebook immediately. Her pencil moved almost automatically as she marked the rhythm using the dots and dashes she had learned decades earlier. More signals followed, separated by careful intervals. Emma watched in complete silence, afraid that even breathing too loudly might interrupt whatever was happening. When the final click faded, the room became quiet again. Helen stared at the page she had just written. The sequence wasn't random. The spacing followed proper timing. Someone trained in railroad telegraphy had once created exactly this pattern. She slowly translated the first few symbols into letters. They formed no recognizable word. Morse symbols produced another incomplete fragment. Several groups seemed to be missing entirely, leaving gaps where meaning should have been. "Does it say anything?" Emma asked softly. Helen frowned in concentration, rereading her notes twice before adding another letter. The message remained frustratingly incomplete, as though only pieces had survived. She carefully rewrote the sequence, adjusting one uncertain mark. Suddenly, the final group became clear. There was no doubt about those last 4 letters. Helen looked up at Emma, her expression changing from curiosity to quiet disbelief. The message ended with a single, unmistakable word: wait. Helen slept very little that night. The single word recorded in her notebook remained on the bedside table where she could see it each time she opened her eyes. Wait. It was too precise to dismiss as imagination. Random mechanical movement could produce isolated clicks, perhaps even a convincing rhythm, but it could not consistently create properly timed Morse characters ending in a complete English word. She reminded herself that extraordinary conclusions required ordinary explanations to be eliminated first. That principle had guided her throughout her railroad career, and she refused to abandon it now simply because the mystery was unusual. Early the next morning, she returned to the signal house carrying fresh batteries, a digital recorder, and several notebooks from her years as a maintenance technician. Emma arrived shortly afterward, balancing her bicycle against the front steps exactly as she had the day before. "Did it happen again?" she asked eagerly. Helen shook her hand. "Not yet. Before we wait for another signal, I'd like to understand more about this building." Together, they searched through every cabinet, drawer, and shelf that had survived decades of neglect. Most contained maintenance forms, outdated operating manuals, or empty folders damaged by moisture. Helen carefully separated papers that might still be readable from those too deteriorated to preserve. Inside a narrow filing cabinet beneath the staircase, she discovered several ledger books covered with dust. Their pages listed routine inspections, equipment replacements, and maintenance schedules stretching back many years. Although much of the information held little immediate importance, Helen recognized the value of keeping them organized. Old records often revealed patterns that newer documents overlooked. By late afternoon, the telegraph sounder remained silent. Emma helped clean one final storage shelf before returning home with promises to come back after school the following day. Alone again. Helen stood beside the dispatch desk, listening to the quiet building. Outside, wind stirred the weeds surrounding the abandoned siding, while distant freight trains continued their regular journeys across the active main line. Just after sunset, the brass arm suddenly lifted. Click. Helen immediately switched on the recorder and opened her notebook. The signal continued at a measured pace. Each group separated with deliberate timing. She copied every dot and dash without hesitation. Years of reading maintenance diagrams had trained her hands to move steadily, even under pressure. When the final click faded, she translated the message one symbol at a time. Most groups remained incomplete, just as before, but this sequence contained several recognizable letters that had not appeared the previous evening. They formed fragments rather than sentences. One name, however, emerged with unmistakable clarity: Evelyn Harper. Helen read it twice before setting down her pencil. The name meant nothing to her. During 36 years with the railroad, she had studied countless historical maintenance records and spoken with retired employees from several generations. She could remember dispatchers, signal maintainers, operators, and supervisors whose careers stretched back decades. She had never heard of Evelyn Harper. The following morning, Helen drove to the small public library. where local history occupied an entire room near the back of the building. Newspaper archives, city directories, and railroad anniversary publications filled several shelves. She spent hours searching employee lists, retirement announcements, historical articles, and memorial pages. There were references to station agents, dispatchers, engineers, and maintenance crews. Evelyn Harper appeared nowhere. Before leaving, Helen asked the librarian whether any retired telegraph operators still lived nearby. After thinking for a moment, the librarian smiled. "You might try Clara Jennings. She worked railroad communications for years before retiring. If anyone remembers the old telegraph days, it would be Clara." That afternoon, Helen visited Clara's modest home on the edge of town. The elderly woman answered the door with kind but cautious eyes. When Helen introduced herself as a recently retired railroad employee restoring the abandoned signal house, Clara's expression immediately softened. "I thought that building was gone years ago," she said, inviting Helen inside. Framed railroad photographs decorated the walls beside neatly arranged shelves filled with books. An old Morse practice key rested in a display cabinet near the window. Helen explained everything that had happened, careful not to exaggerate any detail. She described the unexplained clicking, the recorded sequences, and the translated fragments ending with the name Evelyn Harper. Clara listened without interrupting. When Helen finally unfolded her notebook across the kitchen table, Clara adjusted her glasses and studied the carefully copied dots and dashes. After several quiet minutes, she nodded slowly. "Your timing is accurate," she said. "These aren't random sounds. Whoever created these patterns understood railroad Morse procedure." Helen felt a quiet sense of relief. She had trusted her own interpretation, but hearing it confirmed by someone with decades of telegraph experience strengthened her confidence. Clara traced one sequence with her finger. "Notice the spacing," she explained. "This wasn't casual conversation. These groups resemble operational traffic, the sort of concise communication used between signal houses and dispatch offices." Helen asked whether she had ever known an operator named Evelyn Harper. Clara leaned back thoughtfully. "The name feels familiar," she admitted. "Not because we work together, but because I remember hearing older operators mention an Evelyn many years before I joined. She would have belonged to an earlier generation." "Do you know what happened to her?" Helen asked. Clara slowly shook her head. "No, and that's strange. Railroad people usually leave tracks behind in somebody's memory." Before Helen left, Clara encouraged her to continue recording every signal exactly as received. "Don't try to force meaning where there isn't enough information yet," she advised. "Messages sometimes make sense only after you've collected several pieces." Helen thanked her sincerely. Driving back toward the signal house, she realized the mystery had changed. Until now, she had questioned whether the signals were real. That question had been answered. The greater puzzle was why authentic Morse messages contained the name of someone almost completely absent from local history. That evening, Emma arrived carrying fresh notebooks for organizing the recordings. Helen shared what Clara had confirmed. Together, they labeled each page with dates, times, and weather conditions before placing them in a growing binder. As darkness settled outside, both sat quietly beside the restored telegraph desk. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the brass sounder came alive once again. Click, 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 click. Helen copied every character while Emma counted the pauses aloud in whispers. The message lasted longer than either of the previous nights. Several groups remained incomplete, but enough letters survived to reveal another unmistakable phrase. Helen translated the final sequence slowly, scarcely believing what appeared before her eyes. The message ended with two simple words: bridge line, followed by one final word that left the room in complete silence. Unsafe. The words bridge line unsafe remained on the page between Helen and Emma long after the telegraph sounder had fallen silent. Helen read the message again, checking each symbol against the mark she had copied. There was no reasonable alternative translation. The spacing was correct, the letters were clear, and Clara had already confirmed that the signals followed authentic railroad Morse procedure. Emma glanced toward the dark windows. "Could it mean the bridge is unsafe now?" she asked. Helen considered the possibility carefully before shaking her head. "The telegraph wiring in this building hasn't carried live railroad communication for decades. Whatever created this message came from the old system." She closed the notebook, though the phrase continued pressing against her thoughts. A warning about a bridge suggested urgency, perhaps even danger, but without a date, location, or train number, it remained only a fragment. The next morning, Helen returned to the library and asked for help locating someone familiar with older railroad archives. The librarian directed her to Ben Wallace, a local historian who had spent years cataloging photographs, maps, and business records from the county's industrial past. Ben worked from a cramped office behind the Historical Society's exhibit room. Shelves surrounded his desk, packed with labeled boxes and rolled maps. He listened closely as Helen explained the signal house, the unexplained Morse sequences, Evelyn Harper's name, and the warning about the bridge line. His expression remained thoughtful rather than skeptical. "Old railroad records are scattered," he said. "Some stayed with the company, some went to county storage, and some simply disappeared when offices closed. But we can start with employee directories and dispatch reports." Helen showed him her notebook. Ben studied the copied Morse groups, then examined photographs Emma had taken of the telegraph sounder and the abandoned equipment. "If these messages came from historical operations," he said, "we need dates. Without dates, we won't know which bridge or which incident." Together, they spent the afternoon searching bound employee directories. Names appeared in careful columns beneath headings for engineers, conductors, station agents, clerks, dispatchers, and maintenance workers. Evelyn Harper was absent from every volume they checked. Ben then searched payroll summaries and retirement bulletins. Again, nothing. Helen felt the same frustration she had experienced at the library, only sharper now. A trained operator had sent authentic railroad messages, yet the official records behaved as though she had never existed. Ben finally found a faded photograph of the East Junction signal house, taken more than 50 years earlier. 3 men stood outside beside the staircase, their names written neatly on the back. No woman appeared. Women often worked communication jobs, Helen said, especially during staffing shortages. Ben nodded. Yes, but titles were inconsistent. Sometimes they were listed as clerks instead of operators. Sometimes temporary employees never reached printed directories. It was an ordinary explanation, but it did not account for the complete absence of Evelyn's name. Over the next several days, Helen, Ben, Emma, and Clara began building a timeline from fragments. Clara reviewed the Morse recordings and identified shortened operating expressions that Helen had initially treated as incomplete words. Some indicated track occupancy, others referred to weather, delayed acknowledgments, or line failures. Ben searched newspapers for reports involving bridges, communication interruptions, and railroad delays. Emma organized every result by date, creating separate folders for floods, washouts, derailments, and signal failures. Their first useful connection appeared in a newspaper from 48 years earlier. A severe spring storm had damaged telegraph lines across the county and forced several trains to stop outside East Junction. The article praised railroad management for preventing accidents, but named no operators or dispatchers. Another report from 6 years later described a freight train delayed minutes before debris struck a wooden trestle. Again, the decision was credited vaguely to railroad officials. Helen compared the dates with maintenance ledgers recovered from the signal house. On both occasions, the entries showed emergency repairs to communication equipment within days of the incidents. The pattern was not proof, but it was enough to keep searching. Ben located additional operating reports in county storage. Many were incomplete, and some pages had been damaged by moisture. Yet several included handwritten references to warnings received from East Junction before official inspections confirmed trouble. One report mentioned unstable ground near a bridge approach. Another recorded repeated signal interruptions during heavy rain. A third described a passenger service being held outside the junction because of a message whose sender was not identified. Helen laid the reports across the dispatch desk inside the signal house, while Emma arranged copies of the Morse translations beside them. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The old messages did not describe events after they happened. They appeared to warn about danger beforehand. Evelyn may have been watching conditions locally. Helen said, "An operator in this room could see weather changes, track movement, even water rising near the lower line before anyone in a distant office understood the risk." Clara rested one hand on the edge of the desk. "Experienced operators notice things that never entered official procedure," she said. A change in the sound of a circuit, a delay in an answer, a section crew reporting something that seemed minor until several details came together. Ben remained cautious. "We still need something connecting Evelyn directly to these warnings." Helen agreed. She had no intention of turning a possibility into a conclusion simply because it felt meaningful. That evening, the telegraph sounder produced another broken sequence. The message included a date fragment, the letters E, H, and a reference to high water near a western approach. Ben matched the date to a flood report describing emergency repairs at an unnamed bridge. The official account credited a regional supervisor with ordering trains held back, but the time recorded in the Morse sequence preceded the supervisor's written order by nearly 40 minutes. Helen stared at the comparison, feeling both excitement and sadness. Someone had recognized the danger early, yet the surviving record preserved only the name of the person higher in authority. The following afternoon, Emma searched a shallow cabinet beneath the old wall timetable. Most drawers were jammed by swollen wood, but one opened after Helen carefully loosened it with a flat tool. Inside lay brittle station diagrams, telegraph routing charts, and a folded railroad map stained brown along the edges. They carried it to the dispatch desk and opened it slowly. The map showed the junction, nearby bridges, branch lines, and communication points extending across the county. Several locations had been circled in blue ink. At first, the marks appeared random. Then Helen compared them with the warnings they had already identified. One circle surrounded the western bridge approach mentioned in the latest Morse sequence. Another marked the trestle damaged by debris. A third covered the section where unstable ground had been reported before trains were stopped. Ben leaned closer, tracing the faded circles without touching the paper. Every confirmed warning corresponded to a blue mark. Emma pointed toward the lower corner of the map, where a final circle enclosed an abandoned stretch of track beside a bridge none of their reports had mentioned. Next to it, written in the same blue ink, were 3 words: "Message never received." Helen examined the words, "Message never received," until the fading afternoon light made the blue ink difficult to see. The marked bridge did not appear in any of the reports Ben had gathered, and the abandoned stretch of track had been removed from modern maps years earlier. Still, The note matched the pattern they had already uncovered. Warnings sent before danger was officially recognized. Decisions credited to others, and Evelyn Harper's name missing from every surviving record. Ben photographed the map from several angles, while Emma entered the location into their growing archive. Clara studied the old telegraph routing chart beside it. "This lower line once connected through a separate relay circuit," she said. "If that circuit failed, a message could sound here without reaching the central office." Helen looked toward the brass sounder. Then perhaps Evelyn kept copies because she knew some warnings had vanished. The next morning, they returned to the signal house, determined to inspect every part of the old communication system. Liam joined them after Helen called and explained what they had found. He remained cautious about drawing conclusions, but the repeated timing of the signals and their connection to historical reports had changed his attitude. Instead of dismissing the sounder as loose metal, he arrived carrying electrical testing equipment, inspection mirrors, and a compact camera for examining narrow spaces behind the walls. Together, he and Helen traced the disconnected wiring from the telegraph desk toward the relay cabinets. Most lines ended where equipment had been removed, yet one cloth-covered cable disappeared behind a wooden panel beneath the main control board. The panel looked ordinary, except for 4 screws painted over so many times that they blended into the surrounding wood. "That wasn't meant to be opened often," Helen said. Liam carefully removed the screws while Emma held a flashlight. The panel resisted at first, stuck by age and layers of dried paint. When it finally came free, a cloud of dust drifted into the room. Behind it sat a narrow metal relay box mounted between the wall studs. Unlike the empty cabinets nearby, this box remained sealed. Its surface carried no manufacturer's label, only a small hand-painted letter E. Helen felt her pulse quicken. She checked the surrounding wiring before touching the latch. The cable from the telegraph desk entered one side, while another line disappeared downward beneath the floor. Liam tested the box and found no active electrical supply. "Whatever is inside," he said, "it isn't connected to any modern source." The latch had rusted nearly solid. Helen applied penetrating oil and waited, unwilling to damage the contents through impatience. During that pause, Emma noticed a thin strip of brittle paper protruding from a narrow opening near the bottom. She bent closer without pulling it. Tiny punched marks covered the visible edge. "Is that telegraph tape?" she asked. Clara moved beside her and smiled with recognition. "Yes, paper recording tape." Once the latch loosened, Helen opened the box slowly. Inside was a compact mechanical relay assembly connected to a feed wheel and a tightly wound roll of paper tape. Several smaller coils rested behind it, wrapped in waxed cloth. Dust covered everything, but the protected interior had kept the paper surprisingly dry. Liam examined the mechanism and found a spring-driven feed system linked to the old sounder circuit. "Vibration from passing trains may be releasing the catch," he explained. "Each time it moves, the tape advances and activates the sounder through the mechanical contacts. That's why the messages appear at irregular intervals." Helen felt relief at finally having a practical explanation, yet the discovery made the messages more significant, not less. They were not signals traveling through the present. They were preserved recordings created decades earlier and replayed piece by piece whenever the old mechanism shifted. Clara helped remove the first tape without tearing it. The punched patterns corresponded to Morse timing, while handwritten notes along the edges supplied dates, weather conditions, train numbers, and short explanations. These were fuller versions of the fragmented messages they had heard. One tape recorded a warning about high water near the Western Bridge approach. Another described debris reported by a section crew before the trestle incident. A third contained repeated attempts to send "bridge line unsafe," followed by a notation in blue pencil, Central did not acknowledge, used local circuit. Ben compared the dates with his reports. Each tape matched an event already identified. The records showed that warnings had originated from East Junction before official action appeared in company documents. Evelyn's initials appeared beside several transmissions. Emma photographed every strip, while Clara read the abbreviations aloud. Liam built a temporary support so the fragile rolls could be examined without tension. Helen watched them work together and felt the signal house changing around her. It was no longer merely a structure she had purchased because retirement left her empty. It had become a place where forgotten work could finally be understood. Near the back of the relay box, they found a second compartment hidden beneath a removable metal plate. Inside lay more paper tapes bundled by year, along with several folded message forms. The documents revealed that Evelyn had repeatedly used alternate circuits when storms, floods, or equipment failures interrupted normal communication. Her messages were short, practical, and urgent. She reported unsafe track conditions, ordered trains held until confirmation arrived, and recorded every attempt to reach dispatch. Yet her name remained absent from the official summaries written afterward. Before they could examine the final bundle, footsteps sounded on the lower stairs. Daniel Ross entered carrying a county folder and wearing the restrained expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. He introduced himself as the manager overseeing redevelopment of the former railroad property. Helen had seen his name on auction documents, but had never met him. Daniel glanced at the open relay box and the papers spread across the desk. "I understand you've been restoring the building," he said. "Unfortunately, I need to clarify something about the site. The county had sold Helen the structure, but the surrounding land remained part of a redevelopment corridor. Engineering assessments had now classified the signal house as an obstruction to planned access improvements. Unless historical protection could be established quickly, the building would be removed within several weeks." Helen kept her voice controlled. "Removed means demolished." Daniel nodded. "I'm not here to argue about its value. I'm here because the schedule is already moving." Ben showed him photographs of the tapes and explained that they might contain historically significant railroad records. Daniel listened respectfully but pointed out that unverified materials would not automatically stop an approved project. They needed formal documentation, expert review, and a preservation request before the deadline. After he left, silence settled over the room. The practical obstacle felt heavier than any mystery. They had found Evelyn's evidence only to learn that the place preserving it might soon disappear. Helen turned back to the relay box. Beneath the final coil of tape lay a sealed envelope protected by waxed paper. The handwriting on its front was faded but readable. Clara leaned closer as Helen lifted it carefully into the light. 4 words had been written across the envelope in blue ink: "For whoever still knows Morse." Helen placed the sealed envelope on the dispatch desk and asked everyone to wait while she prepared a clean surface. The paper had survived because the waxed wrapping protected it from moisture, but the edges were brittle and slightly curled. Emma moved the notebooks and tools aside. Liam switched off the portable lamp closest to the desk because its heat was unnecessary. Ben positioned his camera nearby, and Clara sat beside Helen with both hands folded, her eyes fixed on the faded words written across the front: "For whoever still knows Morse." Helen slipped a thin archival blade beneath the flap and separated the old adhesive without tearing the paper. Inside was a folded letter written in blue ink and signed at the bottom by Evelyn Harper. For several seconds, no one spoke. The name they had searched for across employee directories, newspaper files, maintenance ledgers, and official reports now appeared in Evelyn's own handwriting. Helen unfolded the letter carefully and began reading aloud. Evelyn explained that she had worked at East Junction during years when railroad communication depended on aging lines, overloaded circuits, and equipment that often failed during the very storms when accurate information mattered most. She wrote that official procedures required operators to send warnings through central dispatch and wait for acknowledgement before taking further action. In ordinary conditions, the system worked. During floods, lightning strikes, freezing rain, and line damage, it sometimes did not. Evelyn described nights when messages disappeared into broken circuits, when dispatch offices assumed silence meant normal conditions, and when local operators could see danger developing faster than distant supervisors could confirm it. In those moments, she used every available method to keep trains from entering unsafe track. She repeated warnings through alternate circuits, contacted nearby stations, and used local signal controls to hold trains until someone answered. I did not act because I believed myself above authority. Helen read, I acted because a train cannot wait for paperwork when a bridge is moving beneath the water. Clara closed her eyes briefly at the sentence. She understood the discipline behind such a decision and the risk that came with it. Evelyn's letter continued. She had begun preserving duplicate Morse tapes after discovering that several emergency transmissions never appeared in official reports. Some warnings were summarized later without identifying who sent them. Others were attributed to supervisors who issued formal orders only after Evelyn's messages reached them indirectly. She did not accuse those men of deliberate theft. Instead, she wrote that railroad history naturally favored signatures on final reports, rather than the operators who first heard trouble through a wire. The system remembers the order, Evelyn had written. It does not always remember the warning that caused it. Ben stopped taking photographs for a moment and looked toward the rows of paper tapes spread across the desk. The letter gave those fragments a human voice. Evelyn explained that she had hidden the relay box because she feared the old communication equipment would be discarded during modernization. She connected the preserved tapes to a spring-driven recording mechanism, so anyone restoring the sounder might eventually hear portions of the messages. Her method had not been intended to create mystery. It was simply the only protection she could build from the tools available to her. She hoped that someone familiar with Morse would recognize the rhythms as genuine operational traffic and search for the full records before throwing the equipment away. Helen paused when she reached the next paragraph. Evelyn wrote that she did not want personal praise. What mattered was preserving proof that local knowledge had saved lives when formal communication failed. She named section crews who reported rising water, station agents who stayed after their shifts, maintainers who repaired lines in dangerous weather, and operators who passed warnings from one isolated office to another. Her own messages formed only one part of that effort. No train was saved by a single person. Helen read softly. It was saved because someone noticed. Someone believed the warning. And someone acted. Emma looked down at her notes, visibly moved. Until that moment, she had treated the tapes as historical objects to be cataloged. Now she seemed to understand that every punched mark represented a person waiting somewhere along the line, trusting strangers they would never meet. Liam examined the hidden relay mechanism again, this time with open respect. She designed this to survive, he said. Not perfectly, but long enough. Helen nodded. Evelyn's final pages described the incident connected to the blue circle marked "Message Never Received." During severe weather, she had received a local report concerning a bridge approach on the lower line. The main circuit failed before Central Dispatch acknowledged her warning. Evelyn sent the message repeatedly, then used an alternate route to contact a neighboring station. The train was stopped, but the surviving company report credited the regional office with the decision. Evelyn kept the original tape because it recorded the earlier warning and the failed acknowledgments. She believed it offered the clearest proof of why local operators mattered. Ben immediately searched through the dated bundles, but no tape matched the incident described in the letter. Clara checked the handwritten labels while Emma compared them with the blue markings on the map. Every known warning had a corresponding strip, except the one Evelyn considered most important. Helen read the final lines of the letter. Evelyn stated that the last tape contained the complete exchange, including the original bridge warning, the unanswered calls to Central Dispatch, and the relay that finally stopped the approaching passenger train. She had placed it with the other records so the entire sequence would remain together. If the final tape is missing, the letter concluded, then the truth will remain incomplete. They searched the relay box again. Liam removed the feed wheel and inspected every compartment. Emma checked the waxed bundles one by one. Ben searched behind the wall panel and beneath the dispatch desk. Clara reviewed the labels, hoping the tape had simply been filed under a different date. Nothing matched. Helen returned to the letter and examined the fold lines, looking for another note or hidden instruction. There was none. The records already proved that Evelyn had sent warnings before official action, but without the final exchange, they could not establish what happened during the most serious incident or how many passengers had been protected. The approaching demolition deadline made the missing evidence even more dangerous. Historical boards would require documentation strong enough to justify immediate intervention, and Evelyn herself had identified this tape as the clearest record. Emma suddenly lifted an empty paper spool from the bottom of the relay box. A narrow piece of tape remained attached to its core, ending in a clean diagonal edge rather than the rough tear caused by age. Liam examined it under the lamp. "This didn't break," he said. "Someone cut it." Helen held the empty spool beside Evelyn's letter. The final Morse record had once been inside the hidden box. But at some point after Evelyn stored it, someone had deliberately removed the tape. The cleanly cut edge on the empty spool changed the search from preservation into recovery. Helen refused to assume theft or wrongdoing without evidence. The tape might have been removed during maintenance, transferred into a records file, or carried away by someone who understood its importance better than anyone else. Still, the fact remained that Evelyn's most significant message was missing, and the demolition deadline was approaching. Clara studied the empty spool under the lamp, turning it carefully without touching the remaining fragment. Operators sometimes removed a tape when a message needed to be copied into an incident file. She said, "The original could have gone to a clerk, a supervisor, or a maintenance technician." Ben opened his notes. "Then we searched the people connected to the records office." The old employee directories provided little help, but Clara remembered a technician named Walter Ames who had repaired telegraph recorders throughout the division during the final years of the East Junction system. Walter had died long ago, yet his family had kept a workshop and storage building outside town. Clara recalled that he rarely discarded railroad equipment. He believed every broken part had one more use, she said. Ben located the property records and found that Walter's daughter had recently sold the house, but the detached workshop remained under the care of his nephew, Robert Ames, who lived nearby. Helen telephoned him that evening and explained the situation. Plainly, Robert remembered boxes of railroad papers but had never examined them closely. He agreed to meet them the next morning. The workshop stood behind an empty farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. Its roof sagged slightly, and ivy covered one wall, but the door remained locked and dry. Robert arrived carrying an old ring of keys. He was a quiet man in his 60s who admitted that he had postponed clearing the building because every shelf reminded him of his uncle. "Walter labeled everything," he said as he unlocked the door. Unfortunately, His labels made sense only to him. Inside, narrow aisles ran between cabinets filled with relays, wire spools, signal lenses, brass fittings, and carefully wrapped tools. Dust covered the workbench, but the room smelled of machine oil and dry paper rather than rot. Emma stayed close to Helen, carrying the archive box they hoped would hold any recovered material. Liam examined shelves for recording equipment, while Ben photographed labels before anything was moved. They began with boxes marked East Junction, but most contained repair orders and discarded parts. One folder documented the removal of obsolete telegraph equipment from the signal house. The inventory listed a paper recorder, several relay assemblies, and one message tape transferred for review. No destination appeared beside the notation. Helen felt the first real surge of hope. The missing tape had likely left the relay box during an official inspection, rather than being secretly destroyed. Robert searched his uncle's old index cards and found repeated references to a regional records warehouse that had closed decades earlier. Clara remembered the place immediately. It stood beside the old freight depot, she said. When the office shut down, records were supposed to be transferred, but many boxes were left behind. Ben knew the building. Part of it had been converted into commercial storage, while a smaller rear section remained unused. By noon, Robert had given them permission to take copies of Walter's notes, and the group drove directly to the former depot. The current owner allowed access after Ben presented identification from the Historical Society. The rear storage area was colder than the signal house, and crowded with forgotten filing cabinets, broken furniture, and cartons softened by damp air. Emma read labels aloud while Helen and Liam moved boxes carefully. Clara waited near the doorway, guiding them toward categories once used by communications departments: line failures, operator statements, emergency traffic, and equipment investigations. After 2 hours, they found a rusted cabinet marked Telegraph Incidents. Its upper drawer contained routine reports. The lower drawer would not open. Liam removed the damaged handle and eased the drawer forward using a flat bar. Inside were folders warped by moisture but still legible. Ben sorted them by date until Helen recognized the year from Evelyn's letter. One folder bore the name of the lower line bridge and the notation, "Communication failure. Review copy." Helen carried it to a dry table and opened it. The first pages were official reports crediting the regional office with stopping a passenger train before it reached the bridge approach. The language was formal and impersonal. It stated that high water had destabilized the embankment and that the train had been held following supervisory review. Evelyn's name did not appear. Behind the report lay Walter Ames' maintenance notes. He had tested the failed circuit after the storm and confirmed that messages sent from East Junction could not reach Central Dispatch during the critical period. One handwritten line caught Helen's attention. Original local tape attached to demonstrate previous transmissions. The tape was no longer attached. Emma searched the folder again and noticed a narrow envelope stuck inside the damaged back cover. The paper had adhered to the cardboard, hiding it from view. Liam used a thin tool to separate the edges, while Helen held the folder steady. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of telegraph tape, protected by waxed paper. A diagonal cut marked its beginning. Helen placed it beside the fragment from the empty spool. The edges matched. Clara drew a slow breath. "That's Evelyn's tape." They did not unroll it fully in the damp warehouse. Instead, they carried it back to the signal house, where Liam prepared a clean support and Emma positioned her camera above the desk. Clara guided the tape through the old reader by hand, while Helen copied the sequence. The complete message began with repeated warnings from Evelyn reporting rising water, shifting ground near the western support, and visible movement along the bridge approach. She called Central Dispatch 3 times. Each call ended without acknowledgement. The tape then recorded Evelyn contacting a neighboring station through the local circuit. She instructed the operator there to display a stop signal and hold the approaching passenger train until the track could be inspected. A reply confirmed that the warning had been received. The train was stopped less than 2 miles before the bridge. The final section contained a delayed message from Central Dispatch asking why the line had been blocked. Evelyn answered with the same calm wording preserved in her letter. Bridge approach unsafe. Inspection required before movement. Ben compared the times with the official report. Evelyn's first warning had been sent 47 minutes before the regional order. Her local relay stopped the train 29 minutes before Central Dispatch acted. The passenger manifest attached to the incident file listed more than 300 people aboard. Later inspection records confirmed that part of the embankment collapsed before the train could have crossed safely. No one in the room spoke for several moments. Emma looked at the names on the manifest and then at Evelyn's punched message. Liam rested one hand on the old relay box, his earlier skepticism replaced by quiet respect. Clara's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady. She heard the danger. She said, "And when the system failed, she found another way." Helen held the recovered tape beneath the lamp, understanding at last why Evelyn had preserved it. The evidence did not describe a legend or an impossible act. It documented a trained woman doing her job with courage, judgment, and persistence, while hundreds of passengers remained unaware that their lives had depended upon a message almost no one remembered. The recovered tape remained stretched across the supported work surface while Helen compared it with every fragment they had recorded from the telegraph sounder. For days, the messages had arrived as incomplete warnings, broken names, partial dates, and isolated instructions. Now the sequence could finally be reconstructed in order. Emma arranged the scans on her laptop, matching each photographed strip with Helen's handwritten translations. Clara verified the older railroad abbreviations, and Ben compared the times against maintenance reports, storm records, and the passenger train incident file. Piece by piece, the scattered Morse messages became a complete operational record. Evelyn Harper had first received a section worker's warning that floodwater was cutting into the earth beside the lower line bridge approach. She had called Central Dispatch through the primary circuit and received no acknowledgement. She tried again, then a third time. When the line remained silent, she sent the warning through East Junction's local circuit to the neighboring station. The operator there answered. Evelyn ordered the passenger train held before it entered the endangered section. 29 minutes later, the regional office issued its official stop order. By then, the train had already been secured. The final inspection report confirmed that the embankment failed before the train could have crossed safely. More than 300 passengers had continued their journeys without ever knowing how close they had come to disaster. Helen read the completed translation aloud inside the signal house. Her voice remained steady, but the final acknowledgement from the neighboring station caught in her throat. Clara placed a hand gently over Helen's wrist. She was alone in this room when she made that choice, Clara said, but she trusted what she knew. Helen looked around at the old windows, the silent levers, and the telegraph desk where Evelyn had once waited for an answer that never came. She understood that courage had not looked dramatic that night. It had looked like repeated calls, careful observation, and one operator refusing to accept silence as permission to let a train continue. Liam stood near the opened relay box, studying the spring-driven mechanism Evelyn had built to preserve the tapes. When Helen first met him, he had considered the unexpected clicks little more than vibration passing through obsolete equipment. Now he handled every component with the respect of someone examining a sophisticated solution rather than a curiosity. I kept thinking modern systems were valuable because they removed human uncertainty, he admitted. But this proves the old systems depended on people recognizing what procedures couldn't see. Helen smiled faintly. Technology changes. Responsibility doesn't. Liam nodded. He offered to prepare a full technical report explaining how the recorder, relay contacts, and spring mechanism had preserved and replayed the messages. Such a report would help establish that the sounds heard in the signal house came from authentic historical recordings rather than recently created signals. He also documented the disconnected wiring, the age of the components, and the way passing train vibrations had gradually released the feed catch. His skepticism had become careful advocacy, grounded in the same evidence that had changed his mind. Emma took responsibility for creating a complete digital archive. She scanned every tape at high resolution, photographed each label, and entered the Morse groups exactly as they appeared before adding translations beneath them. She created separate files for the original images, Clara's interpretations, Helen's notes, Ben's historical comparisons, and Liam's technical findings. Nothing was altered or cleaned beyond recognition. Every stain, cut edge, handwritten correction, and damaged section remained visible. People should be able to check our work, Emma said. Helen felt unexpectedly proud. Emma was not preserving the records as a school project anymore. She understood that accuracy was part of honoring the people inside them. Ben assembled the historical evidence into a formal report for the County Preservation Board. He included Evelyn's letter, Walter Ames's maintenance notes, the official incident report, the passenger manifest, and the timeline showing that Evelyn's local relay had stopped the train before the regional office issued its order. Clara prepared a signed statement confirming that the abbreviations and timing matched authentic railroad telegraph practice. Helen wrote a concise account of how the materials had been discovered and why the signal house itself remained essential to understanding them. The building was not merely where the records had been stored. Its circuits, desk, relay box, and physical position beside the old junction explained how Evelyn had seen the danger, sent the warning, and preserved the proof. 2 days later, Daniel Ross returned to review their findings. He arrived carrying the same redevelopment folder but no longer treated the signal house as an inconvenience waiting to be removed. Helen showed him the complete Morse reconstruction first. Ben then walked him through the timeline, while Liam demonstrated the relay mechanism and explained why it could not have been fabricated recently. Emma opened the digital archive and displayed the recovered tape beside the official report that omitted Evelyn's name. Daniel listened without interrupting. When he reached the passenger manifest, he slowly turned through the pages of names. "All these people were on that train?" he asked. "More than 300, Helen answered. "Most likely none of them ever knew why it stopped." Daniel looked toward the windows overlooking the lower line. And the official record gave credit to the regional office. The regional office eventually acted. Ben said, but Evelyn acted first. When the main circuit failed, Daniel closed the folder he had brought. He did not pretend that preserving the building would be simple. The redevelopment schedule had contractors, permits, access plans, and county commitments already attached to it. Moving one section could create costs elsewhere. Yet he acknowledged that demolition before formal review would destroy the only surviving site directly connected to the evidence. "I can recommend a temporary suspension," he said, "but the final decision belongs to the town council." Helen appreciated his honesty. "Will you tell them what you saw here?" Daniel looked again at the tapes, the hidden relay box, and Evelyn's letter beneath its protective cover. "Yes," he said. "I came here expecting to confirm that this building had no practical value. I was wrong. His support did not guarantee preservation, but it changed the balance. The redevelopment manager was no longer arguing against them. He was asking the council to consider redesigning the project around the signal house rather than removing it. That evening, the group prepared the materials for the public hearing. Emma printed enlarged images of the most important Morse messages. Ben organized the documentary timeline. Clara practiced reading the operational abbreviations in plain language. Liam finalized his technical diagrams. Helen placed Evelyn's letter and the recovered tape inside protective cases, then locked them in a cabinet for the night. When everyone had gone, she remained alone beside the dispatch desk. The sounder no longer clicked because the tape had been removed from the mechanism. Yet the room did not feel silent. Evelyn's message had finally been heard completely. The next morning, an official notice appeared on the signal house door. The town council would meet in 3 days to decide whether the redevelopment demolition order should proceed or whether East Junction Signal House would receive temporary historical protection. Helen read the notice twice, then looked through the window at the old tracks below. They had recovered the truth. Now the town would decide whether the place that preserved it deserved to survive. The town council chamber was already crowded when Helen arrived carrying the archival case that held Evelyn Harper's letter and the recovered Morse tape. Ben followed with the documentary timeline. Liam carried technical diagrams of the relay mechanism, and Emma balanced a laptop and 2 display boards against her chest. Clara walked beside Helen more slowly than the others, one hand resting on her cane and the other holding her signed statement about the authenticity of the telegraph procedure. Outside, several former railroad workers had gathered near the entrance, speaking quietly beneath the yellow light above the municipal doors. Some wore old Union jackets. Others carried photographs, service pens, or folded timetables preserved from their working years. Helen recognized a few faces from maintenance shops and division meetings long ago. Their presence steadied her. Until that evening. The case for saving the signal house had rested largely on documents. Now, living witnesses had come to explain why those documents mattered. Inside the chamber, Daniel Ross sat near the redevelopment representatives with a revised map rolled beneath his arm. He greeted Helen with a respectful nod. He had not promised that preservation would be easy, but he had submitted a recommendation suspending demolition until the council reviewed the evidence. That decision had already delayed contractors and complicated access plans. Helen understood the practical cost of his support, which made it more meaningful. The council chair opened the hearing by explaining that the vote would determine whether East Junction Signal House received temporary historical protection while a formal preservation application proceeded. If the motion failed, the existing demolition order could move forward. Helen was invited to present first. She stood at the podium, looking at the officials seated beneath the town seal. For a moment, she remembered the morning she had received the retirement email, when her entire career had been reduced to a position no longer needed. She had felt then as though experience could disappear simply because a newer system had replaced it. Evelyn's story had shown her how easily the same thing could happen to history. I purchased the signal house for $180 because I could not watch another railroad building vanish without anyone asking what had happened there. Helen began. I expected to find old equipment. I did not expect to find the work of a woman whose decisions helped save more than 300 passengers. She explained how the telegraph sounder had begun producing fragments of Morse, how the hidden spring-driven relay had replayed preserved paper tapes, and how the messages led them to Evelyn Harper. Emma displayed enlarged photographs of the punched tape and the handwritten labels. Ben presented the official incident file beside Evelyn's transmission timeline. The difference was clear. Evelyn's first warning had been sent 47 minutes before the regional office recorded its formal response. Her local relay had stopped the passenger train 29 minutes before the official order. "We are not claiming the regional office did nothing," Ben said. "We are showing that the surviving report omitted the operator whose earlier action prevented the train from reaching an unsafe bridge approach." Liam then described the recorder and relay system. He explained that the components were period equipment, disconnected from any modern communication network, and preserved behind the original control panel. The messages had not been transmitted recently. Passing train vibrations had gradually released the mechanical feed, causing the old sounder to replay sections of tape. "I first believed the clicking was meaningless mechanical movement," Liam admitted. The evidence proved otherwise. The device preserved authentic operational traffic in the same room where it was originally received and recorded. Clara approached the council table next. Her voice was quiet, but the room became still when she began speaking. She explained railroad MORSE abbreviations, call spacing, acknowledgement patterns, and the discipline required of operators during emergencies. "These tapes were made by someone trained in railroad communication," she said. "The wording is correct. The timing is correct. The procedures are correct." Evelyn Harper knew exactly what she was doing. A council member asked why Evelyn's name appeared nowhere in printed employee directories. Clara answered without anger. Women working communication jobs were often listed inconsistently as clerks, temporary operators, or relief staff. Some never appeared in public rosters at all. "Absence from a directory does not erase the messages she sent." Clara said, "Those messages are her record." The former railroad workers were then invited to speak. A retired conductor recalled nights when local operators held trains before dispatchers understood how badly weather had damaged the line. A signal maintainer described how information once moved through people as much as through wires. Another man carried a photograph of his father standing near East Junction during the same decade Evelyn worked there. He could not identify her in the image, but he remembered his father saying that a woman at the signal house had the best ear on the division. None of the witnesses offered dramatic claims. Their memories supplied context rather than proof, reinforcing the practical world reflected in the tapes. Daniel Ross stood after them. He unrolled the revised redevelopment map and explained that preserving the signal house would require relocating an access lane, adjusting drainage plans, and accepting additional cost. He did not minimize those difficulties. "My original recommendation was demolition because the building appeared structurally obsolete and historically undocumented," he said. "The evidence presented since then changes that assessment. The signal house is not an empty obstruction. It is the physical setting that explains how these records were created, hidden, and recovered." He asked the council to pause demolition while preservation experts evaluated the structure. Questions followed about security, maintenance, ownership, and the condition of the building. Helen answered honestly. The roof needed repair. Several windows required replacement. Electrical service would have to be installed safely. Ben explained that the Historical Society had offered archival guidance. Liam volunteered to prepare a stabilization plan. Emma described the digital archive, noting that every tape, letter, report, and translation had already been copied in multiple formats. The evidence would survive. But Helen emphasized that documents alone could not fully replace the room where Evelyn heard the failed circuit, watched the weather, and made the decision to send her warning another way. After nearly an hour, the council chair called for the vote. Helen sat beside Clara, their hands clasped tightly between them. One council member voted yes, then another. A third hesitated before raising her hand. The final count granted temporary historical protection and suspended the demolition order pending formal review. Applause spread through the chamber. restrained at first, and then warm enough to fill the room. Helen lowered her head, overwhelmed less by victory than by relief. Evelyn's signal house would remain standing. Her messages would not disappear again. As people gathered around the display boards, Ben's phone vibrated. He stepped aside to answer, listened carefully, then turned toward Helen with an expression she could not immediately read. "The National Railroad Museum reviewed the preliminary archive Emma sent," he said. "They want the original tapes, the letter, and the incident records examined by their conservation team." Helen looked down at the archival case in her hands. Ben continued, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "They believe Evelyn Harper's messages may be one of the most important surviving collections of railroad Morse emergency traffic in the country." 2 weeks after the council meeting, carefully packed archival cases left the East Junction Signal House under Helen's watch for the short journey to the National Railroad Museum's Conservation Laboratory. Every item traveled with detailed documentation prepared by Ben, technical reports written by Liam, Clara's signed statement regarding railroad Morse procedures, and Emma's complete digital archive. Helen felt surprisingly calm as museum conservators examined Evelyn Harper's letter, the recovered paper tapes, Walter Ames's maintenance notes, the hidden relay mechanism, and the official incident reports. No one hurried. Every page was measured, photographed, and compared with known railroad communication records from the same period. The process lasted several days. Rather than searching for dramatic revelations, the historians focused on consistency. The handwriting matched throughout the preserved correspondence. The Morse timing followed accepted railroad practice. The paper stock, ink, and recording tapes all belonged to the correct era. Most importantly, the operational messages corresponded precisely with weather reports, maintenance records, and documented train movements already preserved in company archives. The museum's chief archivist finally invited Helen and her friends into a quiet reading room. A carefully prepared report rested on the table. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "your discovery represents one of the most complete surviving collections of railroad Morse emergency communications we have ever examined. The evidence establishes that the records are authentic, historically significant, and directly connected to documented railroad operations." Helen listened without interrupting. The archivist continued, "Equally important, the material demonstrates the professional judgment of Evelyn Harper during several emergency situations, including the bridge incident in which her local communications preceded the official stop order. Her contribution deserves formal recognition within the historical record." Clara quietly closed her eyes, her expression reflecting relief more than triumph. Ben smiled toward Helen, while Emma carefully wiped away a tear before it reached her notebook. Liam simply looked at the restored paper tapes with quiet admiration. Within the following months, the museum worked with the railroad company, county officials, and the Historical Society to update archival records. Evelyn Harper's name was formally restored to the division's operational history. New documentation acknowledged her service as a railroad telegraph operator at East Junction and recognized her verified emergency communications during severe weather operations, including the warning that helped stop the passenger train before the unstable bridge approach failed. No attempt was made to diminish the work of supervisors or dispatchers who later confirmed the danger. Instead, the revised history finally reflected what the preserved evidence had always shown. Safe railroad operation depended upon experienced people at every level, including those whose names had too often disappeared from official summaries. Soon afterward, the Town Council completed its permanent preservation review. Guided by recommendations from the National Railroad Museum and the County Historical Society, East Junction Signal House received protected historical status. Rather than demolishing the building, the redevelopment plans were permanently revised around it. Contractors repaired the foundation, restored the roof, replaced damaged windows using historically appropriate materials, and reinforced the staircase without changing its original appearance. Liam volunteered countless weekends helping restore the remaining signal equipment. The same engineer who had once dismissed the mysterious clicking as meaningless vibration now devoted his technical skills to preserving the relay mechanism that had protected Evelyn's recordings for decades. Ben organized permanent exhibits explaining railroad telegraph communication, local operating procedures, and the remarkable chain of evidence that connected the preserved Morse tapes to official railroad records. Every display emphasized careful documentation rather than legend. Emma spent her weekends cataloging photographs, greeting visitors, and demonstrating the alphabet of Morse code using a restored practice key. Children gathered around her desk, laughing as they learned to send simple greetings one careful click at a time. Helen often watched those demonstrations with quiet satisfaction. The language that many people believe had vanished forever was once again being heard inside the very building where it had served generations of railroad workers. Clara donated several personal keepsakes from her own career, including the practice key displayed in her home for many years. She occasionally visited the museum to answer visitors' questions about life as a telegraph operator. Listening to her explain how operators recognized urgency through rhythm alone reminded Helen that experience could never be measured entirely by technology. Daniel Ross attended the dedication ceremony as well. Standing beside the restored signal house, he admitted that redesigning the redevelopment project had been more complicated than continuing with demolition. It was worth every revision, he said simply. Helen thanked him for seeing the value of evidence when it mattered most. History should be part of progress. Daniel replied, not something progress erases. On opening day, visitors filled the small building from morning until late afternoon. Former railroad employees pointed toward the relay cabinets, remembering long shifts spent keeping trains moving safely. Families studied the enlarged copies of Evelyn's messages beside the official reports that now included her restored place in history. Several descendants of passengers listed on the preserved manifest signed the guest register, grateful to learn why their relatives had reached home safely without ever knowing how close danger had come. Near the center of the dispatch room stood a carefully designed display case. Inside rested Evelyn Harper's original letter, several preserved Morse tapes, Walter Ames's maintenance notes, photographs of the hidden relay box, and the official museum certification confirming the collection's historical significance. Beside the display, a simple bronze plaque carried Evelyn's name and a short inscription honoring the railroad workers whose quiet judgment protected countless lives without seeking recognition. Helen stood before the case for a long time after the last visitors had departed. She remembered the morning she had been forced into early retirement, believing that everything she had learned had become unnecessary. Buying the forgotten signal house for $180 had never been a plan for changing history. It had simply been an attempt to save one neglected building from disappearing. Instead, it had reminded her that knowledge does not lose its value simply because newer tools exist. The skills everyone considered outdated had allowed her to understand the language hidden inside those old recordings. Without Morse, without years spent maintaining signal systems, without patience learned through decades of ordinary work, Evelyn's carefully preserved voice might have remained silent forever. As evening sunlight stretched across the restored dispatch room, Emma finished closing the exhibit panels while Liam secured the windows for the night. Ben locked the archive cabinet containing the original collection before joining Clara downstairs. Helen remained alone for one final moment beside the old telegraph desk. The restored practice key rested where visitors had used it throughout the day. She gently placed 2 fingers upon it and pressed the lever with quiet confidence. Click, click, click. The familiar sound echoed softly through the little signal house that had once been forgotten by nearly everyone. It was no mysterious message from the past this time. It was simply a reminder that some voices survive because someone chooses to listen. Some histories endure because someone refuses to throw them away. And some of the greatest contributions are made not by those who seek recognition, but by ordinary people who quietly do the right thing until, one day, the world finally learns their names. As Helen Carter's journey comes to an end, perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about an old signal house or a forgotten collection of Morse tapes. It's about something much more personal. In a world that moves faster every day, it's easy to believe that experience loses its value once newer technology arrives. Helen believed that too. The day she was forced into early retirement, after 36 years of dedicated service, she walked away thinking the most meaningful chapter of her life was already behind her. But life had a different plan. The very knowledge that others considered outdated became the key to uncovering a forgotten piece of American history. Without her patience, her understanding of railroad signals, and her ability to read Morse code, Evelyn Harper's story might have remained hidden forever. Evelyn's life teaches us another powerful truth. Real heroes rarely know they're becoming heroes. She didn't save lives for recognition. She didn't preserve those messages hoping her name would appear in history books. She simply refused to ignore danger, even when no one was listening. She did the right thing because someone else's life depended on it. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen quietly, with no audience at all. This story is also a reminder that history isn't only found in famous monuments or celebrated names. Sometimes it's waiting inside an old building everyone has forgotten, inside a dusty box of papers, or inside the memories of people who quietly carried their responsibilities every single day. Every family, every town, and every community has stories that deserve to be remembered before they're lost forever. Most importantly, Helen reminds us that purpose doesn't come with an expiration date. Retirement is not the end of being useful. Growing older does not mean becoming less valuable. The skills you've spent a lifetime building may one day become exactly what someone else needs. Your greatest contribution may still be waiting for you in a chapter you haven't even begun. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered an old family story, photograph, or keepsake that completely changed the way you saw your past? Share your experience in the comments below. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten American history, hidden legacies, and ordinary people whose quiet actions made an extraordinary difference, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Until next time, take care of those you love. Treasure the stories that connect us to those who came before us. And remember, the greatest legacy we leave behind is not measured by how loudly the world remembers our names, but by how deeply our kindness, our integrity, and our quiet acts of responsibility continue to shape the lives of others long after we're gone.